I hid my shaking hands at the nursing home, unaware the Mafia boss's mother was testing me. The first time Teresa Belandi tested me, I was holding her teacup with both hands so the china wouldn't chatter against the saucer. My tremor always worsened when people watched, and Teresa watched like a woman sharpening a knife she had no intention of hiding. Her diamond bracelet lay beside the sugar bowl, too expensive to forget, too obvious to miss. I'd been inside St. Agnes' residence for 23 minutes, and I already knew one thing. If my hands betrayed me here, this job would be over before lunchtime. I picked up the bracelet, crossed the sunroom, and told Teresa she had left it behind. She didn't thank me. She studied my fingers instead, the faint tremble running through them like a nervous current under skin. Then she smiled in a way I couldn't read and said, "Good. Most people notice money before they notice conscience." I thought she was a lonely old woman with a taste for drama. I'd no idea I was returning property to the mother of the most feared man in Philadelphia. My name is Mallory Keene. I was 31 that spring, newly hired in resident services at St. Agnes in Doylestown, and practiced at pretending my body didn't embarrass me. Essential tremor sounds mild when doctors say it. Mild means nobody sends flowers. Mild means people think they are being kind when they remove sharp objects, hot coffee, responsibility, dignity. At my last job, a supervisor took a picture from my hands in front of residents and said, "Let's let someone steadier handle that." I resigned before she could pity me again. So I learned tricks. I kept one hand wrapped around the other when introducing myself. I used heavier pens because light ones skipped under my fingers. I carried trays close to my body and breathed through the worst moments until the shaking passed. At St. Agnes, I told myself I only needed a few quiet weeks to prove I could do the work before anyone looked too closely. Then Teresa called me back to her room and asked me to unlock the cabinet where residents' medication was stored so she could fetch her own tablets. Facility policy was clear. Residents couldn't access the medication cabinet without nursing staff present. Teresa knew that because the handbook sat open on her lap, folded to the exact page. "I dislike waiting," she told me, "and I dislike rules written for people who have already decided I'm old enough to be managed." My fingers twitched against my notepad. It would have been easy to please her, easy to avoid offending a wealthy resident on my first day. Instead, I said, as respectfully as I could, that I'd bring the nurse immediately, but I wouldn't break policy. She held my gaze for a long second, then nodded once as if I'd answered a question she hadn't spoken aloud. "Another good sign," she said. I walked out more unsettled than relieved. By noon, she had accidentally sent me to the wrong activity room, contradicted herself about lunch, and asked whether I thought loneliness made people selfish or honest. If you've ever had one weakness you feared the world would use to measure your whole worth, tap like and subscribe. Because before that first shift was over, I learned exactly who meant me harm and who saw past my shaking hands. I met Lucian Belandi an hour later, though I didn't know his surname at first. I only saw what the room did when he entered. Conversations softened. A volunteer stepped backward to clear the doorway. Even Mr. Hanley, who complained through every bingo game and once lectured the priest about parking, went quiet under the shadow of that man in the charcoal overcoat. He was tall without using height as theater, broad-shouldered, silver at the temples, and carrying a paper bag that smelled faintly of fresh peaches. Teresa looked up from her chair and said, "You're late," with the irritation ordinary mothers reserve for ordinary sons. He kissed her forehead, set the peaches beside her books, and asked whether she had taken her noon pills. His voice was low, controlled, almost gentle, but the nurses at the station straightened as though a siren had passed through them. One of them leaned toward me and whispered, "That's Lucian Belandi." She didn't whisper the name like gossip. She whispered it like weather coming in. Lucian's eyes moved to my face, then to my hands wrapped around a clipboard. Nothing in his expression mocked me, but I tucked my fingers tighter anyway. "My mother says many things when she's bored," he replied. "Did she give you trouble?" Before I could answer, Teresa announced that she had been denied access to her own medicine and treated like a rebellious schoolgirl. The room seemed to wait for me to apologize. Instead, I said that residents deserved consistency, not exceptions made because other people were afraid to say no. For one breathless second, I thought I'd just insulted a dangerous man on my first day. Then Lucian looked at his mother and said, "Good. You should be difficult enough for everyone equally." Teresa made a sound of offended dignity. I almost laughed. He turned back to me, and his gaze dropped briefly to the cup trembling in my hand. Without mentioning it, without making a performance of kindness, he reached for the side table, took the full water glass Teresa had ignored, and moved it farther from my elbow so I wouldn't have to brush it while setting down the clipboard. That should not have mattered as much as it did. Men had noticed my tremor before. Usually they pretended not to see it while watching too hard, or they rushed to rescue me from ordinary objects. Lucian simply adjusted the space around me and went on speaking. "Thank you for following policy," he said. "My mother mistakes resistance for an invitation." Teresa muttered that character had become unfashionable in modern staffing. I left the room with my pulse still pounding, annoyed that the most intimidating man I'd ever met had also been the first one all day not to humiliate me. For the next 2 weeks, Teresa kept inventing reasons to summon me. She misplaced reading glasses under a newspaper she had folded herself. She asked whether I'd let a resident's nephew remove family jewelry without written authorization. She pretended to forget that a private conversation in the hall wasn't private at all and waited to see whether I'd repeat what I'd heard. Every time I felt those sharp black eyes measuring not my hands, but something deeper. Every time I left convinced she was testing me and angry that I cared whether I passed. In those same weeks, Lucian appeared often enough to become a rhythm inside the building. Not daily, never predictably, but always at hours that told me he came when no photographer would profit from it. I saw him repair the loose latch on the courtyard bird feeder because Teresa complained the cardinals had become suspicious of defective craftsmanship. I saw him kneel in a pressed wool coat to coax Mabel, our elderly therapy cat, out from beneath a radiator with a strip of roast chicken hidden in his palm. The first crack in my opinion of him came one rainy Tuesday. I was restocking the day room when a resident named Mrs. Doyle tried to stand too quickly, lost her balance, and cursed with the elegant fury of a former librarian. Lucian, who happened to be there dropping off one of Teresa's shawls, crossed the room before anyone else moved. He didn't grab Mrs. Doyle under the arms or bark instructions. He crouched to eye level, held out both hands, and said, "Tell me which knee fails you first so I can be useful instead of decorative." Mrs. Doyle laughed and let him help. A second crack came in the break room. The facility mugs had always been feather-light ceramic, the sort that turned treacherous in unsteady fingers. One morning, they were gone. In their place stood a new set of plain stoneware cups, thicker at the base, heavier in the hand. Nobody announced who had replaced them. I only found out when the maintenance supervisor told another employee, "Belandi dropped them off with the birdseed, said the old ones chipped too easily." He didn't look at me when he said it, but he looked long enough. I tested one of the new mugs when the room was empty. The weight steadied the tremor at once. My throat tightened so fast it hurt. Lucian had noticed a difficulty I spent half my life hiding and solved it without exposing me to gratitude. That frightened me more than open pity would have. Pity I knew how to resist. Thoughtfulness that asked for nothing back was far more dangerous to a woman who had built herself on self-protection. I should have ignored that. Instead, I carried it with me into the week Teresa's heart began acting like a clock with damaged gears. Her diagnosis was no secret. Chronic heart disease, carefully managed, not curable. She joked about it often enough that people forgot jokes are sometimes a way of keeping terror housebroken. The episode came just after dinner on a Thursday. She pressed one hand to her chest, went gray around the mouth, and whispered, "Not tonight," with such genuine surprise that my own fear vanished into action. I called nursing, then emergency services, then Lucian. He arrived before the ambulance doors had fully shut. I remember that clearly because his composure came in with him and bent the chaos around it. He asked precise questions, listened to the nurse's answers, signed what needed signing, and never once raised his voice. Only when Teresa was stabilized in the hospital room around midnight did I see his control slip. He stood by the window with both hands braced on the sill as though the dark outside were holding him upright. I should have gone home. My shift had ended hours earlier, and nobody expected resident services staff to keep vigil in the cardiac unit. But Teresa had grabbed my wrist before they wheeled her upstairs and said, "You started this. Finish it." So I stayed. Near 2 in the morning, Lucian returned from the vending machines with coffee that tasted like scorched pennies and offered me one without asking whether I took sugar. He had somehow remembered from the break room that I drank it black. We sat in a corridor washed pale by hospital lights, while Teresa slept behind glass. It was the first time we spoke without her in the room. I asked whether he ever rested. He said rest and sleep were different countries. He asked whether my hands hurt when the tremor worsened. Nobody had ever asked that. Not whether it looked bad, not whether it inconvenienced me, whether it hurt. I told him sometimes my wrists burned after a stressful day. He nodded as if cataloging a fact that might matter later. Then he said, very quietly, "For what it's worth, my mother was never testing your hands." I turned toward him so fast coffee sloshed over the rim. "You know she's testing me?" He almost smiled, but it never quite arrived. "She has tested every priest, administrator, volunteer, and delivery driver who has come within range of her intelligence. She thinks morality is only visible when a choice is small enough to feel private." I stared at him. He looked back toward the window. "She's usually right." By dawn, Teresa was stable enough to complain that the hospital toast tasted like penance. She kept me there another hour, recounting the defects of cardiology blankets, then sent Lucian to fetch her lipstick from the car because a woman, she insisted, should not look half dead while surviving. When he left, she took my hand, felt the tremor plainly between her rings and my skin, and said, "You think I brought you close to humiliate you? Mallory, if I cared about steady hands, I'd have hired a statue. I care about what a person does when embarrassment, temptation, and pressure all sit at the same table." I stood there so still the shaking almost stopped. She patted my knuckles as if she had solved a minor household inconvenience. "You return what isn't yours. You protect rules when breaking them would be easier. You don't steal dignity from the confused, and you don't flatter power when you could stand upright instead. Your hands are the least interesting thing about you." I'd spent years arranging my life around that one flaw. In a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and weak flowers, an old woman dismissed it in a sentence. After Teresa returned to St. Agnes, something changed between Lucian and me so gradually I couldn't name it until I was already living inside it. He began appearing with absurdly specific things Teresa needed that somehow solved problems I'd never mentioned aloud. A cushion for the desk chair that aggravated my wrist, gloves lined warmly enough for dawn errands, a better latch for the cottage gate outside the staff entrance because I once wrestled it in the rain. Every gift arrived by way of the building, never by way of romance. I tried to stay sensible. He was 24 years older than I was, powerful in ways I didn't respect, and moving through a world where men disappeared behind polite headlines. I rented a narrow cottage with a crooked sink and bought my groceries by comparing unit prices. We didn't belong to the same weather system. But affection doesn't ask whether a thing is wise before it starts growing. It asks whether someone has made room for you without stripping you of pride. And Lucian did that so gently I often noticed only after the fact. The strongest proof came through ordinary hours. In the courtyard, he repaired Teresa's bird feeder with a screwdriver he kept in his car, then waited beside me while the first cardinal tested the new perch. In the chapel, he sat through residents' rambling stories without checking his watch. With Mabel, he became almost boyish, rubbing the old cat's ears until she drooled with bliss. Once, when my hands shook badly carrying soup to a resident who had just learned her son wouldn't visit for Christmas, Lucian took the tray from me and said, "You comfort her. Let me handle gravity." Weeks passed. Teresa improved enough to resume terrorizing the card game table and instructing the cook on proper olive oil. Then, one amber afternoon in early October, she asked me to wheel her to the back garden where the mums had just opened. Lucian had been called away. We sat under a maple, shedding red leaves onto the path like tiny verdicts. Teresa watched me struggle with a paper cup the wind kept trying to steal and said, "If you wait until you stop being afraid, you'll miss most of your life." I told her fear and caution weren't the same thing. She agreed. Then she said, "No, but people pretend they are when caution sounds more dignified." She folded her hands over the blanket on her lap. "Let me save you some years. A woman can refuse pity so fiercely that she also refuses tenderness. Those are not twins, Mallory. They only dress alike from across the room." I knew she wasn't talking only about my tremor anymore, and the knowledge left me raw enough that I changed the subject to birdseed. Her real reveal came 3 days later. She called me into her room, asked me to close the door, and pointed at the chair beside her bed. "I am old, not subtle, so let's finish this," she said. "Yes, I tested you. I tested you because people behave beautifully when they are being watched. I needed to know how you behaved when you believed the stakes were too small to matter." She saw the protest rise in me and flicked 2 fingers. "Oh, hush. The hands were never the question. Character was." She told me she had watched employees before. Some who were tender only when families visited, some who stole time, some who used confusion in the elderly as an unlocked drawer. She had wanted to know whether embarrassment would make me dishonest, whether power would make me pliable, whether loneliness would make me mean. "Your shame makes you careful," she said. "It doesn't make you cruel. That's rarer than steadiness." Then she added, so lightly it almost escaped me, "And my son has not looked properly alive in years. That concerns me too." I should have blushed like a girl. Instead, my chest tightened with something larger and more frightening than flattery. Hope, perhaps. The kind that arrives late and therefore carries a knife. I told Teresa she was meddling. She told me most happy outcomes begin as successful meddling. When I left her room, Lucian was in the hall holding a bag of oranges and looking at me as if he could tell the air around me had changed. Neither of us said what had shifted. We started from that day to say everything else. Autumn turned colder. Shared meals happened by accident until they happened by habit. If Teresa had an evening test or a restless night, I stayed later, and Lucian arrived with coffee or soup or a silence that fit beside mine. We learned each other's small preferences the way lonely people do when they are careful not to name attachment too soon. He liked newspapers folded sharply. I read the last page of books first when anxious. He never stood with his back to an open door. I rubbed my thumb over cup handles while thinking. Then Teresa declined for real. Not a dramatic collapse this time, just the slow, unmistakable surrender of a heart that had negotiated long enough. She tired after simple conversations. Her ankles swelled. On some afternoons, the color left her face so completely she seemed already made of memory. Lucian moved through those weeks with a tenderness that would have broken anyone capable of seeing it. He brushed lotion into his mother's paper-thin hands. He read aloud when her eyes ached. He argued with priests, nurses, and fate, using the same careful tone. I was there for as much of it as work and dignity allowed. Teresa took my hand more often. Once, half asleep, she murmured, "Good, you're both here," with the peace of a woman who believed she had arranged the furniture of the future correctly. The night before she died, she woke just after midnight and asked for the window opened an inch so she could hear the rain. Lucian stood on one side of the bed. I stood on the other. She looked from him to me and whispered, "Companionship is holier than excitement. Remember that when fear starts talking louder than truth." She died at dawn, quietly enough that the machines announced it before either of us did. Lucian bowed his head against the bed rail, but made no sound. I thought then that there are griefs so large, crying would only shrink them. I touched his sleeve because there was nothing wise to offer. He covered my hand with his for one brief second, and in that second I felt every unspoken thing between us draw breath. The funeral, the flowers, the casseroles, the condolences, all passed through a haze that smelled of lilies and rain-damp wool. At Teresa's parish after the burial, Lucian stood beside me while people recited memories polished smooth by repetition. Bianca Belandi introduced herself there for the first time. She was 59, elegant, widowed, and composed with the kind of discipline that looked effortless only because it was ancient. She kissed my cheek, thanked me for being good to her mother, and held my hands between hers one heartbeat too long. "Mama had strong opinions about you," she said. Her smile was warm. Something beneath it felt organized. Bianca began appearing at St. Agnes more often after that. Not constantly, not enough to invite complaint, but with a regularity that seemed to create little currents in the building. She brought pastries to the nursing staff, asked after schedules, remembered everyone's names too quickly. Mabel, who tolerated bishops and oxygen tanks with equal serenity, became inexplicably restless whenever Bianca arrived. The old cat would rise from a nap, ears flat, and stare at the doorway before Bianca stepped through it. I noticed. I didn't understand. Lucian and I kept moving toward each other anyway. Grief stripped the pretense out of us. After Teresa was gone, we no longer needed her as an excuse for every conversation. He walked me to my car when my shifts ended late. I brought Mabel to the Belandi house one Sunday because the cat had slipped into Lucian's empty Mercedes and refused to come out, as though even she knew that mansion needed another heartbeat. He showed me Teresa's room, untouched except for fresh flowers. I showed him how I hid my worst tremor days by tightening my wrists with elastic bands under long sleeves. He never treated knowledge like leverage. That may sound like a small praise, but women know it's not. Once he saw a truth, he guarded it. When I admitted that my greatest fear wasn't dropping something hot or sharp, but becoming someone's project, he said, "Then I'll never love you like a project." He said it softly, as though speaking to himself before daring me with it. The room changed around us. Outside, late leaves scraped against stone. Inside, neither of us stepped back. That should have been the beginning of a simpler story. It was not. Looking back, I can see the trap because Bianca built it out of facts sturdy enough to bear inspection. She never lied. That was her genius and her crime. She studied what Teresa had recognized in us and understood precisely how to make our best qualities destroy us. My dignity, Lucian's refusal to pressure any woman into choosing him, our mutual habit of protecting the other by swallowing pain privately. She didn't need falsehood when truth, cut small enough, could do the work. The first blade entered quietly. Lucian had a legal meeting at St. Agnes regarding charitable property Teresa intended to leave the residence, and a separate issue involving the Belandi Family Foundation. Bianca happened to be there. An administrator asked whether I could retrieve a folder from the conference room next to the chapel. As I approached, I heard Lucian's voice through the partly open door. Calm, controlled, unmistakably his. "Set aside enough money that she can leave cleanly," he was saying. "I don't want her ever forced to deal with my family once this is done." I stopped so hard the file binder slipped against my ribs. Another man answered, too low for me to catch. Then Lucian again. "A cottage would be best, somewhere quiet. Make sure it's in her name alone. If distance gives her peace, I'll not stand in the way." I didn't hear the beginning of that conversation. I didn't hear Teresa's bequest mentioned, or the charitable housing plan they were discussing for retired staff connected to St. Agnes, or that Bianca had specifically recommended using my empty office as a path between rooms at precisely that hour. I only heard the part that broke me, because from where I stood, it sounded as though Lucian had decided my future for me. It sounded as though love, if he felt it at all, had already been translated into payout, relocation, removal. My face went hot, then cold. Every old fear I'd ever carried about powerful men choosing what women needed rose at once. Protection has always been one of control's favorite disguises. Tell me in the comments, if the man you were beginning to love arranged your exit before asking whether you wanted to stay, would that feel like safety to you, or like rejection with better manners? I didn't go into the conference room. I carried the folder back to the desk and told the administrator someone else had already found it. For the rest of that day, I moved through St. Agnes as though my skin had thinned. Lucian found me at dusk in the courtyard beside Teresa's bird feeder. He asked whether I was cold and held out my scarf, which I'd left in the chapel. I took it without letting our fingers touch. Concern flickered across his face. "Bad day?" he asked. "Just long," I said. It was the first direct untruth I'd ever told him. Bianca's second blade came 2 days later. Mrs. Fuller, one of our residents, had been lamenting a son who wanted her to move closer to him in New Jersey. She asked me whether love ever meant asking someone to abandon the life that made them who they were. I answered honestly, because I thought only grief and fluorescent lights were listening. I said sometimes loving a person meant refusing to become another demand laid across their shoulders. I said if I ever loved a man whose whole life was built on obligations I couldn't respect, I'd leave before asking him to dismantle himself for me. What I didn't know was that Lucian had arrived early, that Bianca had sent him through the side corridor rather than the main entrance, and that the chapel door had again been left fractionally open. He heard my voice, but not Mrs. Fuller asking about her son. He heard only the words that sounded like a verdict. I'd leave before asking. Later, he told me, long after it could help us, that he had stood in that hallway feeling both destroyed and grateful. Destroyed because he loved me. Grateful because he believed I'd spared him the humiliation of pleading against my freedom. After that, restraint started poisoning us. Lucian didn't withdraw in any obvious way. He became more considerate, not less, and that made it worse. He asked whether my car needed new tires before winter. He sent fresh birdseed for the courtyard. He arranged for Teresa's room at the residence to be converted into a reading lounge for elderly visitors, just as she had once joked it should be. Every gesture felt like evidence that he cared. Every distance inside those gestures felt like proof he had already chosen an ending. The final meeting happened in the back garden on the last warm evening before November hardened the trees. Teresa had loved that garden best at dusk, when the stones held heat, and the birds argued over the feeder before sleep. Lucian asked if I'd walk with him after my shift. I said yes because I still believed some part of me might be wrong, and because hope is often least rational just before it dies. The sky was the color of cooled copper. Mabel followed us halfway down the path, then sat abruptly and refused to go farther. Lucian stopped beside the bench where Teresa used to command the sunset. His face was composed, but not in the way strangers read as menace. Composed like a man holding a fractured thing together with both hands inside his coat pockets. "I want to say this carefully," he began. "Your peace matters to me more than my preference. If being near me, near my family, near the shape of my life would cost you too much, I'll not ask for what comforts me at your expense." The words were gentle. They landed like earth on a coffin. I looked at the feeder swaying in the wind because looking at him would have broken whatever remained of my self-command. "I appreciate that," I said, hating the formal chill in my own voice and unable to warm it. "And I'd never ask you to become smaller or different so I could feel safer. What you're responsible for, what your family requires, what your name means in the world, those are yours. I won't stand here pretending love entitles me to rewrite them." When I finally met his eyes, relief and grief had already reached an agreement there. He nodded once, as though I'd confirmed something terrible but honorable. "Then we understand each other." That was the moment. Not a slammed door, not betrayal, not a shouted accusation. 4 words spoken softly enough to sound civilized while an entire future collapsed behind them. I wanted to ask what he had meant in that conference room. I wanted to say I hadn't chosen distance, only dignity, but pride, pain, and the conviction that a man with his power had already made arrangements for my departure sealed my throat. So I did what women like me are applauded for until the applause becomes a cage. I left gracefully. I thanked him for his kindness to Teresa. He thanked me for mine. He brushed 2 fingers against the inside of my wrist, not to stop me, only as if committing my pulse to memory. Then he stepped back because he believed stepping back was love. I walked to my car with my jaw locked so tight I tasted blood where I'd bitten the inside of my cheek. Mabel cried from the garden wall like a witness nobody had sworn in. I resigned from St. Agnes 3 weeks later and took a position in elder care near Lancaster. The cottage I rented there had a wood stove, crooked floorboards, and a stand of bare maples behind it that sounded like rain and wind. I told everyone I wanted quieter roads, cheaper rent, a shorter commute. All of that was true. None of it was the reason. The reason was that every corner of Doylestown held Teresa's laugh, Lucian's patience, and the exact shape of the life I believed he had decided I didn't belong inside. I stopped hiding my tremor as fiercely after I moved, not because courage arrived all at once, but because heartbreak exhausts a person past vanity. At the new residence, I told the director about my condition before my first shift and demonstrated how I managed it. She shrugged and said, "Can you comfort frightened people and keep records straight?" I said yes. She said that was enough. On bad days, I still wrapped one hand around the other. On better days, I forgot. The weighted stoneware mug Lucian had arranged for me came everywhere with me like an heirloom from a country that no longer existed. What I didn't know then was how faithfully Lucian continued the rituals that had once included me. Months later, through a former St. Agnes nurse who had no idea what each detail cost me, I learned he still filled Teresa's bird feeder himself every Sunday morning, rather than letting staff do it. He converted her old room into the reading lounge exactly as promised, and stocked its shelves with novels the residents had loved. At a coffee shop near the courthouse, he reportedly ordered 2 dark roasts by habit, then stood staring at the second cup until it cooled. On Teresa's next birthday, I went to early mass in Lancaster because grief follows dates the way dogs follow familiar roads. The church was small enough to hear pages turning. I lit a candle for her, then sat longer than I meant to with my hands around that stoneware mug, now filled with bad parish coffee. At almost the same hour, I later learned, Lucian visited Teresa's old parish in Philadelphia and paid for fresh flowers at the side altar she loved. Miles apart, we performed nearly identical acts of remembrance without knowing it. I prayed for his peace that morning. Not for reunion, not even for understanding, just peace. The kind that lets a man sleep in his own house and a woman set down the story she keeps lifting to test its weight. I imagine he prayed something similar for me because he had always been merciful in private, and because mercy, once genuine, doesn't usually vanish simply because love has nowhere left to go. That was how the year passed. 2 occupied lives, 2 faithful rituals, 2 empty homes pretending habit was enough. The truth reached me by accident, which is almost funny considering how deliberately it had all been arranged. A former administrator from St. Agnes retired and invited several of us to a luncheon. She had no taste for secrecy and less for unfinished grievances. Halfway through dessert, she mentioned, while discussing Teresa's estate paperwork, that Bianca Belandi had been in and out of every scheduling issue that fall like a stage manager. She laughed about how uncanny Bianca had been, always knowing where Lucian needed to be and which room would keep everyone's tempers coolest. My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. I asked what she meant, lightly enough not to alarm anyone. The woman cheerfully explained that Bianca had personally requested the conference room by the chapel for the foundation meeting because Lucian, in her words, thought more clearly around his mother's things. She also admitted Bianca had changed my route that afternoon by asking whether I could fetch the folder instead of one of the clerks. Another employee remembered Bianca insisting the chapel door be left open for ventilation, though the day had been cold enough to make that absurd. Around me, porcelain clicked against saucers. Inside me, the past changed shape. Once that first seam split, every other stitch began to show. I called the nurse who had worked most closely with Teresa. She remembered Bianca asking unusual questions in the weeks before our separation. Whether I ever accepted help, whether Lucian pursued women, whether either of us was quick to defend ourselves when wounded. Then the nurse said something that finally turned confusion into certainty. Teresa, during one of her last lucid afternoons, had apparently told Bianca, with maternal pride, that my self-respect was fierce enough to make me walk away rather than beg, and that Lucian would never hold a woman by force, guilt, or obligation. Bianca had listened. Bianca had learned. Bianca had understood, more clearly than either of us in our grief, exactly which virtues could be sharpened into weapons. She didn't need to forge letters or invent betrayal. She only needed to place true words where the wrong ears would hear them unfinished. The money conversation I overheard had been about charitable housing attached to Teresa's estate, not my removal from his life. Bianca knew I'd hear only the phrases that touched my oldest wound. She also knew Lucian would rather lose me than risk becoming another man who trapped a woman through need. I learned later that Mrs. Fuller's conversation about her son hadn't occurred by chance either. Bianca had volunteered to escort Lucian through the side corridor because the main hall was being waxed. She had paused outside the day room just long enough for my words to reach him, stripped of context. Even Mabel's strange behavior made sense at last. The cat always sensed Bianca before the rest of us, because Bianca never entered like a guest. She entered like someone arranging furniture in a dark room, already deciding what would be moved and what would be left broken. Did Bianca hate me? No, that was the cruelest part. When I finally understood her motive, it was almost respectable from a certain warped angle. She believed I was good enough to pull Lucian toward another life, away from the family machine he had spent decades keeping balanced. She believed his leaving would expose too many people, weaken too many structures, endanger too many dependents. Temporary heartbreak, in her calculus, was a fair price for preserving the Belandi order. She didn't destroy something false. She destroyed something genuine because it threatened something older. You may want me to tell you I marched to Philadelphia, put every fact on Lucian's table, and demanded the life we lost. That's not what happened. By the time the full pattern emerged, a year had already stiffened around our silence. Too much had been built on mistaken mercy. Perhaps that sounds foolish. Perhaps it is. But grief changes people, and so does solitude. I no longer wanted to be chosen because a trap had been exposed. I wanted the version of us that would have asked, in time, one plain question and trusted the answer. That version was gone. Still, the knowledge mattered. It mattered because it proved our love hadn't failed from weakness, boredom, infidelity, or lack of depth. No one cheated. No one stopped caring. No one chose someone else. We were separated by half-heard truths and by the fatal politeness of two people who mistook self-denial for nobility. There are tragedies born from violence, and there are tragedies born from restraint. Ours belonged to the second kind, which leaves fewer headlines and far more ghosts in ordinary rooms. If quiet heartbreaks hit you harder than gunfire or grand speeches, like and subscribe, because stories like this rarely end with applause, yet they deserve witnesses all the same. We talk so often about toxic love, obsessive love, doomed love. We speak less about the kind that might have survived if pride had been a shade less elegant and fear a shade less articulate. That kind leaves no villain anyone can easily see at first. It simply leaves habits where a shared life should have been. I still live near Lancaster. The maples behind my cottage are taller now. On winter mornings, I warm both hands around that heavy mug before driving to work, and sometimes I catch myself turning as if someone has entered the kitchen quietly enough not to startle me. In Philadelphia, I'm told, Lucien still fills a bird feeder on Sundays and keeps a reading room open for people who remind him of his mother. Maybe that's the truest ending I can offer. Not reconciliation, not revenge. Only two people continuing the rituals of a love that never had the chance to become ordinary. And if there's a lesson in what Teresa tried to teach us, I think it's this. Dignity is a fine coat, but it can't warm the life you lose by wearing it too tightly. My hands still shake when I'm tired, angry, or afraid. I no longer think that makes me fragile. Fragile was the silence I mistook for strength. Fragile was the moment we both decided kindness required disappearance. One honest question could have saved us. Instead, it's the question itself that lives with me now, steady as prayer and just as unanswered.